The 911 call came in at 2 a.m., a dead line from a dead building. Detective Elias Thorne, a man whose face had etched the weariness of 5 years on the vice and homicide beats, rubbed the grit from his eyes. He'd seen everything that crawled out of the city's shadows, but the address on the dispatcher's screen was an anomaly: the Oakhaven Civic Records Repository. Nobody worked there past 5. Nobody lived there. It was a concrete tomb for dusty municipal secrets. Dead line, Sergeant, he muttered to the dispatcher, his voice a low rumble. Could be a rat chewed through a wire. Negative, Thorne. The line was active for 42 seconds. No sound, just deep, rhythmic clicking. Like something tapping. The last detail snagged Thorne's attention. A phantom percussion in the quiet hours. He sighed, hitching his belt. Fine. I'm 3 blocks away. I'll swing by. Probably a derelict looking for copper. The repository loomed, a brutalist scar on the city skyline. It was windowless on the first 3 floors, a fortress of bureaucratic information, sealed against light and prying eyes. The main doors were old, steel, and secured with a maglock system that would defy a breaching charge. Thorne circled the building slowly, his cruiser headlights cutting through the damp, midnight fog. Nothing. No forced entry, no smashed windows. He was about to call it in as a false alarm when his gaze settled on the loading dock around the back. The large, reinforced steel door was open, just a crack, about 3 inches. Enough to let the fog ride its way inside, but not enough to suggest a hasty exit. Thorne killed the engine, the sudden silence of the car almost painful. He drew his sidearm, the cold weight a familiar comfort. He pushed the door open, the sound of metal groaning echoing in the cavernous, empty bay. The interior was a chill, concrete labyrinth. Alone, flickering fluorescent bulb cast a sickly yellow wash over the receiving area. Police. Thorne's voice, usually commanding, was swallowed immediately by the air, dying in the high ceiling. That he followed the trail of cold, stale air down a flight of stairs and into the basement, the repository's nerve center and the place where the real old records were kept. The air here was thicker, laced with the musty scent of ancient paper and something metallic, like old pennies. Then he saw it in the middle of the long, silent corridor, beneath a single, naked overhead bulb, was a desk. An old, wooden librarian's desk, one not meant to be here. And on the desk, precisely centered, was an antique rotary telephone. It was plugged into a wall jack that, by all accounts, should have been obsolete and non-functional for 20 years. The receiver was off the hook. Thorne advanced slowly, his boots scuffing the concrete. He reached the desk, his eyes darting to the shadows that clung to the high shelves lining the corridor walls. The phone's receiver lay beside the cradle, a relic of a bygone era. He nudged it with his weapon. Click. It was the deep, rhythmic tapping, the sound the dispatcher had reported. It wasn't coming from the receiver, but from the corridor itself. Thorne froze, listening. The sound was faint but distinct, like a small, heavy pendulum swinging against a wall. It was not mechanical. It had a hollow, bone-like resonance. Click. 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 It was coming from behind one of the heavy, rolling archive shelves 20 feet down the corridor, a shelf labeled in faded white paint, 1950, Unresolved Incidents, Copley County. Thorne raised his gun, his heart thumping a heavy, uneven beat against his ribs. He had to check. He had to see what was making that sound. This wasn't a derelict. This wasn't a rat. He took a step towards the shelves. Suddenly, the fluorescent bulb above the phone popped, showering the desk with glass shards and plunging the entire corridor into absolute, impenetrable darkness. Thorne's vision went white, then black, and in the instant of total silence that followed the shattering glass, the rhythmic tapping stopped. It was replaced by a new sound, one that scraped across his auditory nerves like a file on raw metal, a wet, rasping inhale, much too close, followed by a single, terrifying word whispered directly into the dark, cold air next to his ear. Found. The sheer intimacy of the whisper paralyzed Detective Thorne. He didn't jump, didn't scream, but the trigger finger on his sidearm locked solid. The metallic, foul breath, not human, but colder, staler than the air in the repository, had been right beside his temple. He threw himself to the left, spinning away from the rotary phone desk and hitting the concrete floor with a grunt. his gun instinctively trained on where the sound had come from. He fumbled for his tactical flashlight, the beam cutting a searing white line through the blackness. The light fixed immediately on the empty space beside the shattered bulb, then swept rapidly over the walls. Nothing. No movement, no shadow, nothing to indicate that the owner of that voice was still there. The only thing different was the old telephone. It was no longer on the desk. It was lying on the floor, 20 feet away, right in front of the massive archive shelf labeled 1950, Unresolved Incidents. Thorne cautiously approached, the beam of his light piercing the gloom. The shelf was huge, perhaps 10 feet high and 30 feet long, jammed tight with boxes of decades-old paper. It looked heavy enough to crush a man. He reached the telephone, its black plastic casing gleaming under the bright LED. He kicked it gently with the side of his boot. It slid further under the shelf, disappearing completely. "Whoever you are, show yourself," Thorne barked, his voice steadier now, relying on the training that had kept him alive this long. He knew he sounded foolish talking to a darkness that had whispered a single word. The only reply was the low, electric hum of the outdated ventilation system and the relentless, suffocating quiet. Thorne lowered his flashlight momentarily, focusing on the gap between the concrete floor and the bottom of the steel shelf. He saw it instantly, a smear. Not blood, but something darker, almost black, with a slightly oily sheen. It was concentrated right where the telephone had rested. He knelt, shining the light under the shelf. The space was barely 6 inches high. It was filled with dust, desiccated insects, and a strange, intermittent trail of that same black residue leading deeper into the narrow opening. He saw the telephone receiver resting flat on the concrete, its cord leading to a wall jack far down the corridor, the wrong wall jack. The telephone wasn't plugged into the obsolete one near the desk, it was plugged into a live one on the other side of the building, 100 feet away. It must have been dragged. As the light beam settled on the cord, Thorne noticed something else. Something small, white, and brittle stuck to the black smear near the receiver. He reached under the shelf, careful to keep his eyes and the gun aimed into the corridor. His fingers brushed against the grit and the cold metal. He retrieved the object. It was a tooth, not a molar, but a smooth, incisor-like tooth, unnaturally elongated and sharpened to a point. It felt wrong, heavier than it should be, like petrified ivory. Thorne stood up, the tooth clutched in his gloved palm. He felt a profound, primal dread, the kind that bypasses logic and goes straight for the survival instinct. This wasn't a crime scene. It was a trap. He brought his flashlight back up, scanning the corridor again, moving faster, less methodically. He had to get out, call for backup, and secure the perimeter. He turned toward the way he had come, toward the main stairs. The corridor was now 50 feet longer than it had been before. The stairs were gone. The wall where the basement entrance should have been was now replaced by another towering shelf of archive boxes, identical to the ones he was standing beside. Thorne's breath hitched. He ran forward, throwing his weight against the newly materialized steel shelf. It didn't budge. He hit the box labels, 1949, Missing Persons, Sector 7. He whirled around, panic tightening his throat. He was sealed in. The concrete floor, the shelves, the low ceiling, it was all the same, yet the path to the outside had been swallowed. From the dark, far end of the impossibly long corridor, a sound began. It was quiet at first, a dry, papery noise. It sounded like hundreds of old documents, being rapidly shuffled and turned. Thorne raised his gun and his light toward the sound, his face tight with adrenaline. The clicking hadn't stopped, it had only changed its location. Click 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 click. Then a soft, scraping sound, followed by a heavy object beginning to move. One of the massive archive shelves, the one labeled 1950, Unresolved Incidents, the shelf the phone had been dragged under, was slowly, grindingly, beginning to roll out into the middle of the corridor, perpendicular to the others. Like a massive door opening, Thorne took one deep, ragged breath, knowing he had nowhere left to run. Behind the newly opened gap in the shelves, the blackness was absolute, deep, and final, and from that darkness, two faint, unnerving lights appeared, low to the ground, reflecting the flashlight's beam. They were the color of stagnant rainwater, and they were unblinking. The two stagnant, watery lights were fixed on Detective Thorne. They weren't a reflection from eyes, but a self-contained, cold luminosity that seemed to absorb the light Thorne cast on them rather than bounce it back. Thorn didn't hesitate this time. This was beyond the purview of any city ordinance or criminal code. He raised his weapon and shouted, a raw, desperate sound that echoed off the paper-lined walls, "Police! Freeze!" The thing behind the shelf didn't freeze. It moved. It wasn't a sudden charge, but a slow, deliberate unfolding. A long, brittle appendage, thicker than a human arm and covered in that same oily black residue, reached out from the gap and gripped the corner of the shelf. It pulled. The steel cabinet, which must have weighed close to a ton, ground across the concrete, widening the dark opening with agonizing slowness. Thorn saw more of the creature. It was low to the ground, almost prone, and obscenely elongated. Its body was a mess of sharp angles and concave surfaces, like something starved beyond recognition, yet possessing impossible strength. The watery lights were embedded somewhere in its face, which was a featureless expanse of stretched, pallid skin. The shuffling sound of documents was deafening now, originating from inside the creature's body, a constant, dry rattling that suggested an internal mechanism, not flesh and blood. The thing was holding something in its appendage, something Thorn recognized with a sinking feeling of dread. It was an old file folder, thick with age, stained yellow. It was labeled in crisp, hand-inked lettering, Copley County Incident 77A, The Thorns. "Who are you?" Thorn managed, his voice strained. The file folder held his attention like a magnet. His parents were from Copley County. Incident 77A, the creature's movement ceased. It simply held the file out, its long, bony finger pointing directly at the label. Then, from its unmoving, featureless face, a sound emerged. It was not the whisper from before. It was a horrible, resonant click that seemed to originate from the deepest point in its chest cavity, mimicking the sound of the pendulum. Click. The creature tilted its head, and the two watery lights fixed on Thorn's face. The black residue began to drip from its appendage, sizzling slightly on the concrete floor. Suddenly, the creature's mouth opened. It was a jagged, uneven vertical split in the pallid skin, revealing rows of those same unnaturally sharpened, ivory-like teeth. The teeth from the floor. It didn't speak a full word this time, only a drawn-out, gasping hiss that translated directly into Thorn's mind, a pure, telepathic scream. "You are unresolved." Thorn didn't wait for another sound. The mention of his family, the display of the file, shattered his control. This wasn't a monster, it was a targeted, personalized horror. He fired. The gunshot in the confined space was deafening, a physical blow that rattled the shelves and made his ears ring. He squeezed the trigger twice, the slugs impacting the creature's chest cavity with heavy, dull thwacks. The creature didn't flinch. No blood splattered. Where the bullets hit, the pale skin simply depressed, momentarily distorting the internal rattling of the documents. Then, the skin snapped back into place, smooth and undamaged, as if it were a thick, pressurized rubber membrane, but the shots did interrupt the creature's focus. The long appendage retracted, pulling the file back toward the gap in the shelves. The two watery lights blinked rapidly, click click click, like a camera trying to focus in the dark. This was Thorn's only chance. He wasn't going to defeat it, but he could escape. He shoved his flashlight into his armpit, keeping the beam focused, and reloaded his sidearm with frantic speed. As he slammed the magazine home, he looked down the endless corridor toward where the stairs used to be, the shelves that were beginning to subtly shift. The corridor was not just long, it was changing. It was an elaborate, terrifying maze that closed in behind him and rearranged itself. Ahead, Thorn holstered his weapon and took off running in the opposite direction, toward the unexplored darkness at the far end of the new, impossibly extended hallway. He ran past shelves labeled 1948, discarded claims, 1947, pending judgments, and then, horrifyingly, a shelf labeled 2025, Detective Thorn, pending. As he ran past the last shelf, he felt a sudden, sharp pain on the back of his neck. He slapped at the spot instinctively. When he looked at his hand, it was covered in that sticky, oily, black residue. Behind him, the creature began to roll the heavy steel shelf back into place, sealing itself and the file away. The grinding sound filled the repository, and just before the shelf locked back into its position, Thorn heard the dry, rattling whisper again, fading into the dark. "I have your name now." Thorn didn't slow down. He plunged into the total darkness at the end of the corridor, hoping to find a door, an elevator, anything but another endless wall of files. The black residue on his hand felt cold, and the sudden, intense itching on the back of his neck began to spread. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever that substance was, it was not just a stain, it was a tag. Detective Thorne ran blindly into the oppressive darkness. The floor beneath his feet was no longer cold concrete but aged, parquet wood, creaking loudly with every frantic step. The shift in flooring was jarring, completely out of place in the basement of a modern repository that he swung his flashlight wildly. The beam illuminated a new sight. The walls were lined not with steel shelves, but floor-to-ceiling wooden cabinets, antique and intricately carved. Each drawer front was adorned with a small, brass label holder. This wasn't the records repository, it was a museum of the forgotten. A card catalogue of the dead that he slowed, fighting the instinct to just keep running. Panic was what this thing fed on. He needed to find an exit, the itching on his neck intensified. He reached up and scraped at the patch of black residue. It felt like dried tar, clinging stubbornly to his skin and hair. He swore under his breath, knowing the tag was still there, connecting him to the creature. Thorne forced himself to look at the brass labels. They weren't indexed by year or section, but by names that he ran a glove over the metallic labels. Ashworth, M. Suicide, 1971, Bennett, disappeared, 1965, Chase, S. Unclaimed, 1932. Every drawer held a file of a life that ended tragically or mysteriously in the city. He realized he was running through an archive of the permanently lost that he slammed his shoulder against a wall, searching for a seam, a doorway, anything. The heavy, dark wood didn't give. He was trapped in a box whose dimensions were defined by misery. Click. 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 The rhythmic tapping had resumed, but it was softer now, muffled, as if coming from within the walls themselves. Thorne pulled his sidearm again, his breath misting in the cold air. The sound was centered on a large, double-wide cabinet a few feet ahead. This cabinet was unique. It was not labeled with a name, but with a simple, gold-plated plaque that he pointed his flashlight at it, squinting against the gloom. Pending, accessioned. As he read the word accessioned, the cabinet began to shudder. Not violently, but with a deep, structural vibration, like a building shifting its foundations. Thorne retreated, training his gun on the unit. From the two central drawers of the cabinet, the sound of the tapping intensified, transitioning from a rhythmic sound to a rapid, desperate rat-a-tat-tat, like someone trapped inside, using a sharp object to signal their presence. Then, one of the drawers, labeled with a single, handwritten tag, J. Thornley, 1950, slowly, silently began to slide. Open. Thorne swallowed hard, holding his breath. He aimed the weapon, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The drawer slid out 6 inches, stopping with a soft, final thunk. Inside, there was no paper, no file, no corpse. There was only a perfect, undisturbed, shallow bed of freshly turned soil, but resting on the dark soil, facing Thorne, was a child's leather satchel. It was old, worn, and smelled faintly of wood smoke. And pinned to the satchel, with a sharpened piece of that ivory-like tooth, was a faded photograph. Thorne felt his heart drop into his stomach. It was a picture of his father, Elias Thorne Sr., at perhaps 10 years old, standing beside a small, stern-looking man, his grandfather, who died decades before Thorne was born. The photo was taken in front of a building he now recognized as the old Copley County Courthouse, demolished in 1970. The title on the drawer, J. Thornley, 1950, made his blood run cold. His father's middle name was Joseph. He used to hate it that he heard the shifting behind him. He didn't need to look. The archive was closing in, shuffling its terrible contents. The gentle, rasping whisper returned, this time not next to his ear, but seemingly woven into the creaks of the old wood. It sounded like air escaping a sealed lung. Your father's file incomplete. The debt transferred. Now, you serve as record. The words were interspersed with the dry, papery rattle of the creature's internal archives. Thorne fired 3 shots into the cabinet beside the open drawer, hoping to break the flow, to shatter the structure. The wood absorbed the bullets with a solid, resistant crack, but the structure remained intact. As the smoke cleared, the long, bony appendage snaked out of the open drawer, covered in the black residue and clutching the leather satchel. It didn't reach for Thorn. It reached into the air above the drawer. With a horrifyingly precise movement, the appendage pinned the satchel to the wall, right beside the plaque, using a second, longer, needle-sharp ivory tooth. Then, with a sound like tearing parchment, the appendage pulled a sliver of skin and a lock of dark hair from the back of Thorn's neck, detaching the tag of black residue. Thorn cried out, stumbling backward. The small piece of his own flesh, the black residue still clinging to it, was carefully placed inside the open, Thornley drawer, and the drawer slid shut with a profound, definitive thud. The shuffling of papers stopped. The clicking ceased. The silence that followed was total, terrifying. Thorn was leaning against the cold wood of the opposite cabinet, panting, the back of his neck bleeding sluggishly. He looked at the accessioned cabinet. It was sealed. It looked exactly like the others. The wooden maze was silent. But the walls, the floor, the heavy air, everything now felt like a predatory organism. He looked down the corridor. In the place of the unending walls of cabinets, a single, modern steel door had materialized, glowing faintly under a low red emergency light. It was the color of fresh blood on concrete. It was an exit. But a terrifyingly easy one. On the door, a small, digital display flashed a single word: accepted. Detective Thorn stared at the glowing red door, the word accepted flashing with a cold, insistent light. The door was modern, steel, bolted into the ancient wooden wall of the catalog room, a jarring, hideous anomaly. It represented a direct exit, a way out of the suffocating maze of history, but the ease of its appearance felt inherently wrong. He pressed his back against the opposite wall, sucking in deep breaths. The scratch on his neck burned, a physical reminder that he was now indexed, his file officially opened in this terrifying bureaucracy of the dead. He wasn't going to walk through a door labeled accepted. He needed to find the original basement exit, the one that had been swallowed by the first shifting shelf. He turned and retraced his steps, his flashlight beam frantic. He ran back through the long corridor of wooden drawers. He checked the Thornley, 1950 drawer, still sealed. The area was silent, motionless, but the air thrummed with latent energy, the quiet before a trap springs. He reached the end of the wooden archives and stopped abruptly. The shift was complete. The wooden catalog cabinets had seamlessly melted into the concrete shelves of the records repository basement, the transition point unmarked. But where the shelves labeled 1949 and 1948 should have been was now a featureless wall of dark, wet concrete, slick with condensation. The path back to the first corridor was gone. He was sealed off in a tiny, asymmetrical chamber formed by the new concrete wall, the old steel archives, and the single, glowing red door. Thorn swore, the sound rough and desperate. He was left with only two choices: the menacing, easy exit, or the crushing reality of the sealed concrete wall. He chose the wall. He slammed his fist against the slick surface, then kicked it, testing its stability. It was solid, load-bearing, utterly final. As he stepped back, the steel shelves directly to his right began to shudder. These were the shelves labeled 1950, Unresolved Incidents, Copley County, the original shelf, the one that had concealed the creature. The grinding noise returned, much quieter this time, accompanied by the dry, papery rattle. Thorn drew his gun again, aiming at the junction where the shelves met. Instead of the creature rolling out, a single box, an ancient, brown cardboard file box tied with sun-faded twine, was pushed slowly, deliberately, out of a gap near the floor. It stopped 10 feet from Thorn's boots. The box had been crudely scribbled with a single word in thick, black residue: widow. Thorn hesitated. This thing wasn't attacking him directly. It was playing a psychological game, using the information it had just accessioned about his family. He cautiously approached the box, flashlight steady. He nudged it with his foot. The twine was loose. He squatted down, ripping the twine open. Inside, stacked neatly, were dozens of black and white police mugshots, all from the 1950s. They were faces of young, grim-looking women, all of them wearing heavy, thick-rimmed glasses, and all of them staring directly at the camera with hollow, dead eyes. He flipped through them quickly. Each photo had a stamped date and a name: Doris A., 1951, Martha R., 1950, Eleanor B., 1953. Underneath each name, written in the same neat hand as the Thornley tag, was the single word, widow. He stopped when he reached the middle of the stack. A photo was different. It wasn't a mugshot, but a professional studio portrait. a beautiful, serious woman, early 20s, with striking eyes, wearing a modest wedding dress. The name written beneath it was not a surname. It was only the first name, Anna, and written underneath that, not the word widow, but two distinct sentences, Anna, lost in service. See file, father's debt. Thorn felt a cold wave wash over him. Anna was the name of his mother. She had died of a sudden, mysterious illness when he was 12. His father rarely spoke of the time before he met her, or her family. He lifted the photo, his hands trembling. Underneath the photo, at the bottom of the box, was a small, desiccated item, a child's wooden toy train car. It was chipped and missing a wheel. Thorn recognized it instantly. It was the only toy his father ever kept. He said it was a gift from his own father, Thorn's grandfather, the man in the picture from the accessioned drawer. Click, click, click. The sound was back, emanating from the train car. The small wooden toy was tapping itself against the bottom of the cardboard box, and then, the red door, 10 feet away, began to hum. The word, accepted, changed to processing. From the seam of the red door, a thin, silvery liquid, looking exactly like refined mercury, began to weep and pool onto the concrete floor. It flowed toward the archive box, bypassing Thorn, heading directly for the wooden train car. Thorn scrambled up, dropping the box. The train car and his mother's photograph were now resting in the middle of a growing puddle of toxic, flowing silver. The creature's voice, a dry, hollow echo, seemed to vibrate the very air in the small chamber. You must choose who is next. The record demands payment. Thorn looked from the train car, a symbol of his father's buried past, to the red door, which now flashed, finalizing. He knew that if the silver liquid touched the wooden toy, whatever debt was owed would be paid, and he would be free, but paying that debt might mean locking his family's curse into the repository forever. He made a split-second decision. He grabbed the flashlight, jammed it between the closing steel shelves, forcing them open by a fraction, and squeezed through the gap, leaving the box, the photograph, and the silver pool behind. He didn't make it. As he slid through, the shelves slammed shut. The small train car and the photograph were swallowed by the silver mercury, which hissed and evaporated instantly, but before the walls closed completely, Thorn heard a new sound, a faint, tiny cry, muffled by the concrete. A child's sound, and on the back of his hand, where he'd rested it against the closing shelf, a fresh smear of the black, oily residue reappeared. This time, it didn't itch. It felt heavy, cold, and permanent. The red door behind him now flashed the final, silent word, filed. The small, dark stain on the back of Detective Thorn's hand felt like a cold brand. He knew that the creature had re-established its link, essentially re-indexing him the moment he touched the shelf and abandoned his mother's photograph and his father's toy to the quicksilver. The current chamber, small and airless, was now completely silent, dominated by the blank, chilling silence of the filed door. He looked around. There was no way out. The steel shelves were fused shut. The concrete wall was solid. The only remaining path was to engage with the horrors of the repository. He pressed his hand against the concrete wall, testing for weaknesses. The wall felt cold, wet, and slightly flexible, almost like cured leather stretched taut over a frame. He hammered his elbow against it. It absorbed the blow with a dull, sickening as his hand moved across the wall. His flashlight beam caught something almost invisible in the condensation. Faint, etched lines, barely visible. He leaned in, wiping the moisture away with his sleeve. The lines were organized, delicate etchings forming a complex pattern. It was a map. It wasn't a map of the repository, but a diagram of the human central nervous system, drawn in frightening detail, starting from the spinal column and branching out. Where the cervical spine met the skull, the diagram focused on a single, labeled point, C1, etched beside the C1 label. In that same neat, unsettling hand, were 2 lines of text. Entry point, Thorn residue. Transfer complete, debt collector initiated. The black residue on his hand seemed to pulse faintly under the light. Thorn realized the creature hadn't just indexed him, it had implanted something, using the scrape on his neck as an entry point. He was no longer just a victim, he was a host, a vessel being prepared for a purpose. Suddenly, the steel shelves that formed the back of the chamber began to hiss. Not from air pressure, but from friction. the metal was separating, but not rolling open. It was being pulled apart horizontally, creating a thin, jagged line that grew wider by the inch. Thorn aimed his gun. He expected the creature to emerge, but what followed was far stranger. From the growing gap, the dense, suffocating blackness did not stream out. Instead, a torrent of archived paper poured forth, thousands of brittle, yellowed documents, falling like a silent, dry waterfall into the small room. The floor was instantly covered in a deep drift of historical records. The papers were all from the 1950 Unresolved Incidents File.as. The documents covered the floor. The two watery, stagnant lights appeared again, low to the ground, reflecting faintly in the drifts of paper. The creature was crawling out, silent and slow, like a spider emerging from a paper cocoon. That it dragged its elongated body over the documents, causing a muffled, terrible rustling noise, the sound of 1,000 forgotten lives being crushed under its weight. The creature's voice, a dry, wheezing hiss, was closer than ever. The record must be complete. You will write the final chapter. It reached a hand out, the long, sharpened finger pointing to a specific document lying on the floor. Thorn kicked at the paper, scrambling for distance. He looked down at the document the creature had singled out. It was a police transcript from 1950, a grainy photocopy of a statement given by a woman, Anna, widow of J. Thornley. The statement detailed the disappearance of her husband, Joseph, a city clerk who had been investigating irregularities in the repository's old ledger system. It was a simple report, but the final, handwritten note at the bottom was stark. Officer's comment: subject appears traumatized. Claims the office ate her husband and that she hears tapping from the walls. The creature was closing in. It reared up slightly, its vertical mouth opening to reveal the rows of ivory teeth, the pale, featureless face inches from Thorn. The watery eyes pulsed slowly. Thorn fired 3 rounds directly into the creature's face. The paper documents around the creature shuddered, but the creature itself remained unharmed. It merely tilted its head in mock confusion. The paper on the floor around Thorn, however, began to move. Individual documents lifted themselves off the ground, fluttering into the air as if caught in a sudden updraft. They circled Thorn, forming a tight, swirling vortex of yellowed history. From the creature's chest cavity, the dry rattling intensified, and a single, deafening thought flooded Thorn's mind: you will be the new ledger. The paper vortex tightened. The edges of the documents, brittle and sharp with age, began to cut small, fine lines into Thorn's exposed skin, his hands, his face, his neck. The cuts were not deep enough to bleed much, but they were numerous, 1,000 paper cuts drawing his blood into the spinning mass of archived records. As his blood mingled with the dry paper, Thorn realized the horrific intention. The creature wasn't trying to kill him, but to tattoo him with the history of the lost. To physically turn him into the missing pages of the archive. He fought the paper, swatting desperately at the swirling documents, but they were relentless. The black residue on his hand was now glowing faintly, attracting the papers like a magnet. In a final, desperate move, Thorn grabbed his K-bar knife from his belt. He didn't stab the creature. He drove the blade down hard, not into the monster, but into his own hand, cutting away the skin where the black residue was thickest. He roared in pain, throwing the severed piece of skin, thick with the black stain, into the paper vortex. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The moment the blackened skin hit the vortex, the paper exploded outwards, scattering into the far corners of the chamber. The creature let out a soundless, psychic shriek of pure frustration, and the 2 watery lights on its face dimmed completely. Thorn stumbled back, bleeding profusely, his hand shredded. The creature, temporarily stunned, retreated into the gap between the shelves, dragging its elongated body back into the darkness, the sound of papers shuffling fading away. The steel shelves slammed shut again with a final, echoing clang. Thorn looked down at his bleeding hand, then to the wall. The map of the nervous system was still there, but a new sentence was etched underneath the diagram: wet and fresh, hostile entry. Rerouting. He was still in the labyrinth, but the creature had just been temporarily banished, and the labyrinth itself was changing its internal structure again to counteract his move. He knew he had bought himself maybe 30 seconds, tops. He had to find another path, and fast. Thorn pressed his flashlight against the cold, wet concrete wall where the diagram of the nervous system had been. the etching was gone, replaced by a smooth, featureless surface. He glanced at his hand, the wound still raw and throbbing where he had cut away the residue-stained skin. The brief surge of adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that he had bought time, but the monster's psychic scream, rerouting, still echoed in his head that he turned toward the only other feature in the small chamber, the fused steel shelves that now felt like a permanent, mocking wall. He hit them, expecting resistance, but this time, the entire structure groaned, not from the pressure of the creature, but from internal mechanics, with a low, grinding whir. The middle three shelves, those labeled with the dreaded 1950 and 1949 years, retracted simultaneously, sliding back into the concrete wall. They revealed a small, dark room beyond, a space barely large enough to stand in. It was a single, claustrophobic cell, illuminated by a harsh, swinging bare bulb overhead. The walls were lined not with files, but with mirrors. Cheap, distorted carnival-style mirrors, reflecting and twisting the light, creating an infinite, horrifying loop of Thorne's bloodied, panicked image. In the exact center of this mirrored cell was a single, modern element, a small, steel table and two bolted-down chairs, like an interrogation room, and seated at the table, facing the entrance, was a woman. She was young, dressed in a simple, gray linen dress that looked decades out of fashion. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly. She was holding a stack of the same brittle, yellow documents from the archive, which she was calmly reading by the swing lamp's light. She looked up at Thorne, her expression neutral, almost bored. Her eyes were deep, startling green, the same color as the stagnant water lights of the creature. "Detective Thorne," she said, her voice soft but unnervingly clear, cutting through the claustrophobic air. "I'm glad you chose not to accept the exit. It would have been very final." Thorne gripped his gun, his flashlight fixed on her face. "Who are you? What is this place?" She smiled, a thin, humorless curve of her lips. "I am the interrogator." "This place? It is where the Ledger holds its hearings. And the Ledger wants to know why you keep fighting your accession." She patted the stack of papers. "We have the files now, Detective. Your father, Joseph Thornley. Your mother, Anna. And now, you. The Ledger wants to close the Copley County Incident 77A file once and for all. You are the final piece." "My father was not involved in any Incident 77A, Thorne snapped, stepping cautiously into the room. He hated the mirrors, the thousand reflections of his fear. "Oh, he was," the interrogator replied, picking up a single page from the stack. "The original file states that Joseph discovered the repository isn't just a building for records. It's a structure that feeds on them. Specifically, on the unresolved. If a life ends with a question mark, a disappearance, a suicide ruled suspicious, an unsolved crime, the Ledger consumes the incident and incorporates the soul into the structure." She looked directly at Thorne, her green eyes piercing. "Your father was the city clerk who found the first ledger, the creature, trapped in the 1950 archives. He was going to expose it. He disappeared," Thorne said, his voice flat. "The papers said he just left." "He ran," she corrected, tapping the paper. "But he didn't run alone. He ran with his wife, Anna. Your mother. He gave her protection." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The Ledger demands a life for a life. An unresolved for an unresolved. When your father escaped, he left behind a substitute. A life that could stand in his place." Thorne felt a cold dread settle over him. "Who?" The interrogator smiled cruelly and flipped the document over. The back was a simple form, dated 1950, Copley County Children's Services. Thorne didn't need to read the name. The picture on the form was that of a small, frightened girl, perhaps 7 years old, with huge, terrified eyes. When Joseph ran, he sealed another case into the archives to satisfy the Ledger. He didn't just leave a toy, he left a proxy file. A little girl whose missing person case was declared unresolved immediately following his disappearance. The interrogator picked up a small, bloodied piece of skin, Thorne's severed residue-stained skin, from the table. It was perfectly intact. The ledger has been patiently waiting for the debt to mature. It needed one of Joseph's bloodline to complete the file transfer. That is why the black residue rerouted to you. She tossed the skin onto the ground. The creature's rhythmic tapping, soft and dry, immediately started underneath the floorboards of the interrogation room. The interrogator stood up, placing her hands flat on the steel table. The ledger offers you a final chance to leave. To walk through the red door, now flashing exit again, back in the other room. Thorne looked past her, into the dizzying reflections of the mirrors. He saw his own face, distorted and terrified, but in one reflection, the mirror behind the woman showed the horrifying truth. The interrogator had no reflection, and where she should have been reflected, the mirrors showed the featureless, pale, elongated creature, sitting patiently in the chair, its long, sharp fingers tapping the papers. The interrogator was merely a flesh suit, an elaborate disguise for the archive monster. "If I leave," Thorne asked, his voice shaking but steady, "what happens to the girl my father traded?" The creature/woman tilted its head, its voice a perfect, crystalline sound of pure falsehood. "She remains resolved. And you walk free." Thorne stared at the lie in the featureless reflection. He knew the cost of his father's freedom. He raised his gun, pointing it directly at the interrogator's green eyes. "No deal," Thorne whispered. "Unresolved cases don't walk away." Before he could fire, the woman's face stretched, the skin peeling back at the corners. The green eyes flickered to the milky, stagnant white of the creature. "Then, you are the ledger's new file." The mirrors surrounding Thorne all shattered simultaneously, the sound deafening. The swinging bulb exploded, and Thorne was plunged into the echoing, absolute darkness, alone with the shrieking sound of breaking glass and the overwhelming, foul stench of old paper and something ancient and hungry. The explosion of 1,000 mirroring reflections left Detective Thorne temporarily deafened and blinded. He shielded his face, the stinging dust of pulverized glass and ancient paper filling his lungs. The interrogator's shriek, soundless yet overwhelming, was still vibrating in his skull. He dropped his tactical flashlight in the confusion, the beam spinning wildly across the shards on the floor. He fumbled, retrieved it, and swept the light across the small chamber. The room had vanished, the walls were no longer mirrors. They were rough, exposed wooden laths, spaced a finger width apart, creating a dizzying, striped pattern. The interrogation cell had dissolved into the structural skeleton of the building itself, a crawlspace between the walls. The rhythmic clicking began instantly, but it was muffled, coming from the wood right next to his ear, as if the space between the laths held the creature. Click. 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 Thorne moved quickly, ignoring the pain in his bleeding hand as he stepped carefully over the glass. He had to find a seam, a door, a weakness in this new, terrifying enclosure. He noticed the air pressure was dramatically dropping, sucking the oxygen out of the space. The dust and paper debris were being pulled toward a large, dark shadow at the end of the lath corridor, a fan. An industrial fan, rusted and ancient, whirring slowly in reverse, trying to create a vacuum. If he stayed, he would suffocate. He ran toward the fan, knowing it had to lead somewhere, even if that place was the monster's lair. As he got closer, the walls shifted again. A heavy, old wooden desk, entirely out of place, slid out of the lath wall with a grinding noise. It was covered in thick, green velvet, and topped with a single, massive brass ledger. The ledger, the book, was at least 2 feet thick, bound in dark, stitched leather. The cover was blank, save for a single, small silver plaque, proxy file, S7, unresolved. Resting beside the ledger was an object that made Thorne freeze, a perfectly preserved child's doll. It was porcelain, wearing a tattered white dress, and it lay face up, its large, empty glass eyes staring directly at him. The clicking intensified, emanating from the doll's chest. Thorne realized the tapping sound he'd been hearing since the beginning wasn't the creature's pendulum. It was the little girl, trapped inside the archive, signaling her presence. The doll was her final, tangible form in this realm. The creature's dry, rasping whisper filled the air, seemingly coming from all the laths at once, surrounding him in a horrific chorus. The ledger awaits the final entry. The proxy must be erased. The massive ledger on the desk began to slowly open. The binding creaked, and the pages, impossibly thick and filled with minute, hand-inked script, exposed the current entry. The top of the page read, Thornley, J. 1950, resolved by proxy, 1951. The bottom of the page, however, was blank, save for a single, ominous heading, Thorn, E. 2025, status, pending. A thin, dark quill pen, tipped with a sharpened ivory point, another one of the creature's teeth, levitated from the desk. It hovered above the ledger, ready to scrawl the final verdict. Thorn knew he had to act. He had to stop the creature from writing his own name into the archive, and more importantly, he had to free the girl whose file was being used to seal his father's death. He looked at the doll. It was the key. If the girl was the proxy, her physical symbol, the doll, was the weak point. Ignoring the suffocating air, Thorn holstered his gun and grabbed the doll, yanking it off the desk. The moment his fingers touched the cold porcelain, the doll's glass eyes snapped shut, and the constant, clicking sound in the wall ceased instantly. The silence was the loudest, most profound sound yet. The creature's voice stopped. The quill pen fell to the desk with a clatter. Thorn, holding the doll like a shield, looked up at the lath walls. The creature was furious. From the dark aperture of the antique fan, the two watery, malevolent lights reappeared, pulsing rapidly. The creature's full body, elongated and impossibly thin, began to slowly pull itself out of the fan aperture, folding and unfolding its brittle limbs. It was too large to fit, yet it was emerging that it wasn't attacking with speed. It was attacking with intent. As the creature struggled free, the laths of the walls began to peel away, revealing the horrifying truth. The space behind the laths was not a building structure, but a dense, writhing mass of black, oily tendrils, hundreds of them, all pulsing with the black residue. The tendrils shot out, not at Thorn, but at the ledger. They wrapped around the thick brass cover and began pulling it closed, trying to seal the proxy file forever. Thorn knew that if the ledger closed before he could find the girl's name, she would become permanently resolved, consumed, and he would be next. He looked at the doll in his hand. The girl was trapped inside the object, not the book. He had to exchange the doll for the girl's name. With a yell, Thorn smashed the porcelain doll against the massive brass ledger. The fragile porcelain shattered, scattering a fine, dry powder onto the open page, and from the broken shell of the doll, a faint, translucent wisp of energy, a ghostly human outline, floated up, momentarily illuminating the room with a flash of pure, terrified white light. The creature screamed, a sound that finally registered as a low, wet gurgle of sheer agony. The tendrils recoiled, leaving the ledger open. The ghostly wisp of the girl's proxy soul did not ascend. It flew, instead, directly into the open page of the ledger, and solidified onto the blank, pending line. The quill pen, still hovering, immediately scrawled a name onto the page, replacing Thorn, E. 2025, status, pending. The new entry read, Jones, Lila K. 1951, status, unresolved. File transfer complete. Lila K. Jones. The girl's name. The ledger slammed shut with an echoing, triumphant finality. The creature, half emerged from the fan, shrieked again, but this time, the sound was different. It was a howl of loss. The laths, the desk, the ledger, and the tendrils all dissolved into the blackness, which instantly pulled back to reveal the next chamber. Thorn was now standing in a long, narrow tunnel of dripping wet, gray marble. At the far end, a single, flickering fluorescent light illuminated the word, Administration. The girl's name was free. But the ledger, now sealed, was still hungry. The entire marble tunnel began to gently vibrate. Thorn felt a terrible certainty. The creature was no longer chasing him for the debt. It was chasing him for revenge. Detective Thorn stumbled onto the smooth, gray marble floor of the administration tunnel. The ceiling was low, the air here smelling sharply of ozone and cold stone. The corridor was unnervingly long, stretching into a hazy distance where the single fluorescent light flickered. The tunnel didn't feel like a structure. It felt like a throat. The low vibration intensified, growing into a deep, guttural thrum that resonated in Thorn's teeth. The marble walls began to shimmer, the slick surface distorting and undulating like water under a strobe light. Thorn realized the creature wasn't attacking him directly. It was warping the very foundations of the repository around him. The tunnel was contracting. The distance between the marble walls was narrowing rapidly. Thorn could hear the scraping of stone against stone, the sound of colossal geological pressure building. If he didn't move, he would be crushed into a layer of human paste. He ran, his boots slipping on the highly polished floor. He swung his flashlight along the wall, searching desperately for a weakness, an escape route, anything that wasn't a dead end. Just as the walls compressed to a space barely wide enough for his shoulders, he saw it, a small, almost invisible niche carved into the marble near the floor. It was a utility recess, barely 6 inches high, hidden behind a loose maintenance panel. He threw his body to the ground, scraping his face on the marble, and slammed his hand into the panel, wrenching it free just as the walls stopped closing, locking him into a paralyzing, tight squeeze. Inside the niche, resting on a bed of dry, white powder that smelled faintly of lime, were 2 items, a heavy ring of brass keys, and a small, laminated paper, a maintenance log. Thorn pulled them out, his breath ragged. He unfolded the brittle log under the beam of his light, his body trapped, the pressure of the walls immense. The log was handwritten, dated 1946, and signed by a chief engineer, Department of Municipal Infrastructure. It was not a horror document, it was a simple instruction sheet, terrifying in its banality. The title read, Core Function 1, the Ledger Entity. Thorn scanned the technical script frantically. The entity is not a spirit or haunting, but a localized dimensional compression caused by the mass centralization of unresolved data. It requires a constant flow of new files to maintain the repository's integrity and prevent implosion. The entity is bound to the original 1910 central ledger, the brass book, and the central utility shaft, CUS, for weakness. The entity has no solid physical form, standard force is ineffective. It is susceptible only to de-indexing, the total resolution of a core unresolved file. Specifically, S7L Jones. If the proxy file is resolved by an external, live agent, i.e., given a defined end, it will cause a systemic failure in the entity's core memory, initiating a 15-minute shutdown cycle. Precaution, the entity's true name, used for access, is the keeper of the lost index. Thorn felt a jolt of ice water hit his veins. Lila Jones. He hadn't just saved her, he had turned her into the creature's weakness. The goal was no longer to escape, but to find Lila's true file and bring it to a resolved end. The walls began to vibrate again, stronger this time. The creature knew what he was reading. The brass key ring held 5 heavy, oddly shaped keys. One of them had a small, plastic tag, CUS 4. Thorn realized his next move. He had to find the central utility shaft. The pressure on the walls reached a critical point. The marble began to crack, sending hairline fractures spiderwebbing across the slick surface. Suddenly, a section of the wall beside him shrieked with grating pressure and exploded inward. It wasn't the creature, but the silver, mercury-like liquid, a torrent of the toxic metal pouring into the compressed space. The creature was trying to flush him out or dissolve him. Thorn scrambled backward, pushing off the marble, finding his strength in desperation. The mercury hissed as it pooled, eating away at the dry powder and the discarded maintenance panel. He saw the escape, a black, square hole that had been concealed behind the exploding marble panel. It was a narrow, vertical drop into absolute darkness, smelling of damp earth and rust. The central utility shaft. He grabbed the key ring, thrusting it into his pocket, and shoved the precious maintenance log under his vest. He threw his flashlight down the hole, watching the beam fall for a terrifyingly long time before it hit something metal below. As the mercury-like sludge washed over his feet, Thorn launched himself into the gaping, dark hole. He fell several feet, catching himself on a rusted metal ladder that cut into his bleeding hand. He clung to the ladder, his body spinning precariously in the blackness. He looked up. The marble tunnel, the administration corridor, was now completely sealed. The walls fused shut, leaving only a dark, heavy silence above him. He was in the central utility shaft, suspended between the floor and the roof of the repository, deep in its mechanical core. But down below, the single flashlight beam illuminated a sight that made him gasp. The shaft opened into a vast, concrete cavern, and stretched across the floor, meticulously ordered and illuminated by hundreds of tiny, glowing dots. Was a huge, elaborate blueprint of the entire repository, and hovering over the center of the blueprint, the 2 faint, malignant green eyes of the creature were waiting. The creature was ready for the final confrontation in its nerve center. Detective Thorn tightened his grip on the rusted metal rungs of the ladder, the pain in his cut hand a raw, focusing ache. He descended into the vast, concrete cavern of the central utility shaft, CUS-4, the air thick with the metallic tang of rust and ancient machinery. His flashlight, lying on the floor below, cast a single, stark beam across the gargantuan blueprint. The drawing covered the entire floor, a detailed, glowing schematic of the repository's internal structure, every floor and shelf meticulously mapped in fine, pulsing blue lines, and in the center of the blueprint, its featureless, elongated form resting directly on the drawn foundation of the building, was the keeper of the lost index. The two watery green eyes glowed brighter than the blueprint lines. Thorn dropped the remaining distance, landing silently on the concrete beside the edge of the blueprint. "You should not have read the instructions, Detective Thorn," the creature hissed, its voice no longer a dry whisper, but a resonant, amplified sound that seemed to boom from the cavern walls themselves. "Ignorance is safety. Knowledge is accession." The keeper's long, brittle appendage reached out, the tip resting on a glowing blue dot near the center of the blueprint labeled Core Memory, S7. "You freed the name, but the ledger still holds the file. And now that you know its location, you are compelled to approach. That is the nature of the unresolved." Thorn ignored the taunt. He scanned the immediate surroundings. The cavern was filled with dormant machinery, massive pumps, generators, and a single, rusted control panel bolted to a column near the blueprint's edge. That he sprinted toward the panel, drawing the brass key ring from his pocket. The keeper didn't give chase. Instead, the entire blueprint under its body began to move. The glowing blue lines rose off the floor like a sudden, metallic swell. The concrete beneath the blueprint fractured and shifted, forming sharp, asymmetrical waves of solid ground. Thorn scrambled up the side of a concrete wave, the movement throwing him off balance. He reached the control panel just as the floor below him dropped away into a sheer, black pit. That he fumbled with the keys, his adrenaline-shaking hand making the task impossible. The keeper watched, its head slightly tilted, the soft clicking returning, a sound of amused impatience. "That panel is for maintenance, Thorn. Not control. You cannot delete the ledger with a key." Finally, the CUS-4 key slid into the lock. Thorn cranked it hard. The control panel, a complex matrix of outdated dials and broken lights, suddenly sparked to life. A faint, low, whirring sound emanated from the machinery around the room. The blueprint's movement stuttered. Thorn slammed his fist down on a large, red emergency button labeled Override. The panel screamed, an unbearable high-pitched tone that momentarily deafened Thorn. The creature roared a silent, mental shriek of pain, and its two green eyes dimmed to mere pinpricks. The override didn't destroy the creature, but it stabilized the infrastructure. The concrete waves froze instantly, leaving Thorn precariously balanced on the jagged, tilted landscape. He grabbed the maintenance log from his vest. He scanned the blueprint until he found the faint blue lines marking the coordinates for S7, Core Memory. "Lila K. Jones," Thorn gasped, reading the coordinates aloud. "Third floor, north wing. Security vault D12. The keeper, still resting on the blueprint, slowly began to reform. The skin on its face tightened, stretching impossibly thin, and a deep, vertical scar appeared, the permanent mark of its psychic shriek. "You have the coordinates, Detective," the keeper rasped, its voice now laced with pure, focused hatred. "But the path to the vault is sealed by the resolved. Every case that has been consumed by the ledger is now a guard. They will know you carry the key to their unmaking." The creature lifted its brittle appendage and pointed past Thorn, down a narrow, dark utility access tunnel that led away from the cavern. From the tunnel's mouth, a faint sound began, dry, scraping, like fingernails dragging across metal. Then, a figure stepped into the light, a man in a stiff, outdated suit, his eyes wide and vacant, the skin on his face dried and yellowed like old parchment. It was Joseph Thornley. Thorn's own father, who had been resolved by proxy decades ago, now resurrected as a mindless, archival guard. Thorn stared, his heart seizing in his chest. His father's file was sealed, and the ledger had made him a sentry. "Final act, Detective," the keeper sneered. "Face your legacy." Thorn raised his gun at the shuffling figure of his father, the weight of the moment crushing him. He knew he couldn't shoot. He had to bypass him and get to the vault. He turned and bolted toward the access tunnel, the final, desperate dash toward Lila's file and the repository's core weakness. Behind him, the shambling figure of his father began to give chase, his old leather shoes scraping a terrifying cadence on the concrete floor. Detective Thorne didn't look back. The sound of his father's shuffling footsteps, a hollow, dragging cadence that spoke of decades entombed, was the most terrifying thing he had ever heard. That he plunged into the narrow access tunnel, which was no ordinary maintenance passage. The walls were lined with copper piping and exposed conduits, but suspended within the gaps were hundreds of the brittle, yellowed faces of the resolved. They hung like dried fruit, their empty eyes fixed on Thorne, their mouths open in silent, papery screams. As he ran, the closest figures began to peel themselves off the wall, dry limbs cracking, and joined the chase. The tunnel was becoming a surging river of the ledger's consumed memories. "Joseph! Stop!" Thorne yelled, the sound swallowed by the rush of his own breath. He couldn't shoot. He raised his flashlight and fired it like a weapon. He threw the beam directly into his father's face. The sudden light seemed to momentarily blind the desiccated figure. Joseph Thornley raised a brittle arm to shield his face, pausing just long enough for Thorne to squeeze past a large pump housing. Thorne reached the end of the tunnel, which terminated at a heavy, bolted metal door. He ripped the brass key ring from his pocket, frantically testing the keys until one, a large, ridged key, slid into the lock. He threw the door open and burst out onto the third floor, north wing. The corridor was spotless, illuminated by cold, industrial fluorescence. It was the only normal-looking section of the repository he had encountered, a brutal contrast to the horror beneath. The scraping sounds from the tunnel entrance ceased. The resolved could not enter the operational section of the building. He ran the length of the hall, past cubicles and fire extinguishers, guided by the coordinates in his mind. He found it. Security Vault D-12. It was a bank vault door, thick, circular, and secured by a massive chrome wheel. There was no visible lock, only a small, archaic keypad embedded in the frame. He fumbled with the remaining keys until he found one that looked like a large, old skeleton key. He inserted it into a hidden slot beneath the keypad, and with a heavy clunk, the vault's locking mechanism disengaged. Thorne gripped the chrome wheel and strained, forcing the heavy door open with a screech of tortured metal. He entered the vault. The space was small, climate-controlled, and sterile. In the center, on a stainless steel pedestal, rested a single, small, reinforced file box, stamped with the ominous label, S7. He closed the heavy vault door behind him, plunging the interior into darkness save for his light. He felt a surge of triumph mixed with bone-deep exhaustion. He was at the source. Thorne opened the box. Inside was a single, thin file folder. The cover read, Lila K. Jones. Age 7. Proxy file. 1951. He opened the file. The pages contained not police reports, but a simple, handwritten letter and a child's shoe. The letter was from an orphanage matron to the Copley County Chief of Police, dated 1951. It detailed how Lila Jones, an orphan child, was terrified of being alone. The letter concluded, Lila did not run away, Chief. She went into the disused basement of this building and sealed herself inside an old file cupboard, believing if she was filed away, she would not be forgotten. We found only her small shoe. Lila Jones was not murdered or disappeared. She had died of exposure and fear inside the repository, her body consumed by the unresolved files, making her the perfect proxy. Her case was incomplete, not unsolvable. Thorne grabbed the small, tattered shoe from the file. He knew what he had to do to resolve this case. He had to give Lila's story a definitive, final ending. He pulled his K-bar knife again and stabbed it through the letter and through the small, muddy child's shoe, pinning them together to the wall of the vault. He leaned in and whispered, his voice shaking with finality, Lila K. Jones. Age 7. Died of exposure and fear inside the records repository basement, 1951. Case closed. Resolved. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The vault shuddered. The stainless steel pedestal beneath the file box cracked with an explosive sound. The small shoe and the letter, pinned to the wall, instantly turned to fine, gray ash, but before Thorne could even turn around, the massive, vault door behind him began to groan. The steel buckled inward, warping under an enormous, unnatural pressure. From the distorted, narrow opening, the creature's long, bony appendage reached through, followed by its elongated, pale head. The keeper was covered in burns and fractures from the system overload, its oily residue sizzling on the metal. Its voice was a dry, choking gasp of pure rage, and oh, you cannot resolve the core memory. The creature squeezed its impossible body through the buckling vault door, forcing the steel to peel away like aluminum foil. It was bleeding black residue profusely, but it was inside the vault. "You are unmaking me, Thorn," the keeper hissed, its two green eyes blazing with final, psychotic intensity. "But I will take the ledger back, and I will index you, and all your ancestors, into pure darkness." Thorn was trapped. The vault was too small to fight, and the creature was standing between him and the only exit. He was face to face with the collapsing ledger. This was the final, inescapable moment. The small vault reeked of ozone and decaying paper as the keeper of the lost index forced its shattered body through the steel. The damaged creature was faster, more feral, driven by pure, agonizing fury at the violation of its core memory. Black, oily residue dripped from its vertical mouth. "You resolved the proxy," the keeper shrieked, its voice now a wet, scraping sound of grinding teeth. "But you cannot resolve me. I am the structure. I am the ledger." It lunged, its long, bony appendage whipping out. Thorn ducked under the attack. The sharp, ivory finger missed his head by an inch and plunged deep into the concrete wall behind him with a cracking sound. Anchoring itself, Thorn glanced at the wall. Beside the now shattered pedestal, there was a small, circular brass plate, a secondary lock or access port, previously concealed by the pedestal. He remembered the maintenance log. The creature was susceptible to de-indexing, which caused a 15-minute shutdown cycle. He had used the key to start the process in the CUS-4, but he needed a final, definitive command. And the key to the ledger's access was its true name. Thorn reached into his pocket and retrieved the last remaining, oddly shaped brass key. It was smooth and flat, more like an old computer chip than a key. He slammed the key into the access port on the brass plate. It fit perfectly. The keeper, still anchored to the wall, tried to pull itself free, its watery eyes darting between Thorn and the brass plate. "No. That is the override loop. You cannot bind the keeper." "I'm not binding you," Thorn yelled, pulling out his K-bar knife. He used the tip to quickly etch a word into the soft brass plate, right next to the inserted key. He etched the one thing the creature feared, unresolved. Then, taking a deep breath, he screamed the creature's true name directly into the access port, "Keeper of the Lost Index." Shut down. 15 minutes. The vault exploded in a blinding flash of white light. The air filled with the smell of burning paper and superheated metal. The keeper let out a final, devastating shriek, a pure, raw sound of memory being violently erased. Its body convulsed, shedding large chunks of pale, dead flesh and black residue. The appendage tore itself from the wall, and the creature collapsed, its elongated form dissolving onto the floor, melting into a dark, steaming puddle of residue and fine, gray ash. The creature was gone. The core entity had been banished. Thorn scrambled to his feet. The systemic shutdown had begun. The lights in the vault flickered and died. The building around them groaned, the concrete walls beginning to weep thick, oily black liquid. The repository itself was hemorrhaging the essence of the consumed files. Thorn sprinted to the warped vault door, squeezing through the narrow gap the creature had created. The entire third floor was now shaking violently. He didn't take the stairs. He found the elevator shaft and used the heavy maintenance keys. He still had to pry open the rusted inner door, revealing the cabling. He jumped onto the top of the elevator car and rode the emergency brake down 7 terrifying floors, arriving at the main floor in a storm of sparks and grinding metal. He ran through the main lobby, now pitch black, the ceiling raining plaster and dust, and threw his weight against the main steel mag-lock doors. With one final, wrenching shriek of metal, the sound of the system dying, the doors burst outward. Detective Thorn stumbled out onto the sidewalk, inhaling the damp, cool midnight air. He collapsed onto his knees, covered in blood, residue, and ash, his ears ringing, his hand throbbing savagely. He looked back at the Oakhaven Civic Records Repository. The brutalist building was silent, dark, and utterly still. It had shut down. It was now just a concrete tomb again. Thorn staggered up and started walking away, leaving the horrors behind. He made it 2 blocks before the metallic taste returned. He stopped, leaned against a street lamp, and looked down at his uninjured left arm, near the wrist,